My name is Elly. I'm the founder of Second Light, a nonprofit that helps women rebuild their lives after divorce. I started it 8 years ago with nothing but a broken heart, a law degree, and the stubborn belief that no one should have to face starting over alone. That morning, I was on my way to host a workshop for new clients at the community center. The sun had just come up and the parking lot was mostly empty. I pulled into my usual spot near the side entrance, sipped my coffee, and reached into the back seat for the tote bags I'd prepped the night before. That's when I saw Melissa's car. She was parked across the lot windows, cracked phone to her ear. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she was finishing up a call before joining me inside. But then I heard my name. I froze halfway out of my car. Her voice carried in the quiet morning air. She was laughing. That dry, clipped laugh she used when she thought something was beneath her. She said my name like it was a problem to be solved, something about how the board was already on edge about the finances, about how she had everything lined up to push me out by the end of the quarter. She said I had grown too attached to the mission, too emotional, that someone needed to step in and make it profitable. That's when I realized she wasn't just venting. She had a plan. She mentioned talking to a consultant, building a case, and setting the groundwork with funders. She said once I was gone, they could drop all the fluff and finally streamline the programs. More clients, less hand-holding. I couldn't breathe. I stayed crouched in my car, heart pounding in my ears. She had been my partner in this from the start. I brought her in 2 years ago when the workload became too much. She was brilliant with logistics and funding. I thought we balanced each other out. I thought we were building something real. But to her, it was just a strategy. I heard her end the call, grab her bag, and walk toward the building. I didn't move. Not right away. My coffee sat untouched in the cup holder, the steam curling up like it didn't know the world had just shifted under my feet. That workshop went on as planned. I showed up on time, smiled through every introduction, and answered questions like nothing had changed. But inside, something had cracked wide open, and I knew even then there was no going back. Melissa and I met at a conference in Baltimore. It was one of those breakout sessions that most people use as an excuse to check their emails, but she stayed after and asked thoughtful questions about a case study I'd presented. We ended up sharing a cab back to the hotel and talking late into the evening over coffee in the lobby. Back then, I was still running Second Light solo out of my garage. I was doing intake calls during my lunch breaks, hosting group meetings in church basements, and personally following up with every woman who walked through our doors. Melissa had been working in nonprofit consulting. She spoke the language of scaling sustainability and outcomes. I found her energy refreshing. She saw potential in what I'd built and offered to help me grow it. At first, it was exactly what we needed. She created systems I'd never even considered. We got grants I didn't have time to apply for. With her help, we hired staff, moved into our first real office, and tripled the number of women we served in under a year. I trusted her because she believed in the mission. At least that's what I thought. The first time we clashed, it was over the intake process. I'd always insisted on hour-long initial sessions so we could understand each woman's story, not just her legal or financial situation. Melissa thought 30 minutes would suffice. She said we could double our capacity that way. I told her we weren't a clinic. These women weren't numbers. She didn't argue. She just nodded and said we'd revisit it later. Then came the conversation about workshops. She wanted to offer pre-recorded videos instead of in-person sessions. Said we could reach rural clients that way. I agreed to test the idea. But it never sat right with me. Something got lost when we took the human presence out of it. For many of our clients, just sitting across from someone who listened without judgment was half the healing. I remember Tanya so clearly. She was 41, recently divorced from a man who drained her savings and left her with 2 teenagers and no home. She came to us after living in her car for 3 weeks. During our first session, she wouldn't look me in the eye. She kept her arms folded tight across her chest like armor. But she showed up. Week after week, she came. and little by little she unfolded. We helped her find transitional housing and enroll in a job training program and reclaim her credit. But more than that, we helped her believe she wasn't broken. The day she got the keys to her own apartment, she brought in homemade banana bread and cried in the doorway. She hugged every staff member like we were family. That day reminded me of why I started this in the first place. Melissa didn't dislike Tanya, but when I tried to share what that moment meant, she smiled politely and moved on to a discussion about revising our program structure. I told myself she just expressed things differently, that not everyone needed to feel things the way I did to care deeply. I kept making excuses for her detachment. Looking back, the signs were everywhere. The sudden cancellations of our storytelling nights, the way she'd steer team meetings toward metrics and budget sheets, cutting short client impact stories, because they were, in her words, not data-driven. She started calling our work a service model instead of a mission. I laughed it off. I thought we were just different in how we worked toward the same goal. But we weren't working toward the same goal. And I think deep down I knew that long before the morning I overheard her call. I just didn't want to admit it. I'd been so focused on building something meaningful that I didn't see I'd invited in someone who was quietly dismantling it from the inside. The hardest part isn't that she turned on me. It's that I let her get close enough to do it. After that morning in the parking lot, I didn't confront Melissa. I smiled through our meetings, nodded at her ideas, and even let her lead the planning for our upcoming funders retreat. She took my silence as surrender, and I let her. Behind the scenes, I started preparing. I backed up every file I had access to, including client testimonials, impact reports, and grant documentation that I personally managed. I met quietly with 2 of our long-term partner organizations and told them I was considering launching something new. I didn't say much, just enough to gauge their interest if I ever chose to pivot. One afternoon, while Melissa was out meeting with potential sponsors, I cleaned out my office drawer and took home a small, leather-bound notebook. It wasn't just any notebook. It was filled with handwritten letters from our clients. Some were thank you notes, others were stories they'd written in our healing workshops. These pages carried the real weight of our work. I wasn't about to leave them behind. That same week, I delivered a gift to Tanya. It was a journal I'd personalized for her. Inside, I'd transcribed her own words from our sessions, the affirmations she'd repeated when she couldn't trust herself to stand alone. On the last page, I left her a short note. I told her that no matter where life took either of us, she had already rewritten her story. She hugged me tight and cried. She had no idea what was coming. Neither did Melissa. I began sketching out a framework for something new. It wouldn't be a rival nonprofit. It would be a consulting model, a program designed to help other community organizations adopt our most human-centered practices. Quietly, I began asking around about office spaces near the women's shelter. Melissa kept thinking she was building her takeover plan, but what she didn't see was that I had already started building something else. Not to fight her, to free myself. And this time, I'd make sure the soul of what I'd built could never be stolen again. In the weeks leading up to the retreat, I leaned in. I praised Melissa's vision in team meetings, let her take full control of the agenda, and encouraged her to present our future direction to key funders. She believed I was stepping aside. I let her. At the same time, I scheduled quiet lunches and late afternoon coffees with the people who mattered. Directors of foundations, community liaisons, leaders of referral networks. I walked them through a new model, one that kept our personalized care intact, but made it teachable, replicable, certifiable. I called it the Second Light Framework. The response was swift and clear. They were tired of organizations promising efficiency at the cost of empathy. They missed the warmth we had built. More than a few hinted at redirecting funding if I ever launched something aligned with that original mission. I took notes. I didn't promise anything, but I left those meetings knowing I wasn't walking away from support. I was walking toward it. The night before the retreat, I wrote my resignation letter. It was brief, respectful, and final. I printed 2 copies. I placed one on Melissa's desk before sunrise. The other, I slipped into the front folder of her welcome packet for the retreat. That morning, as staff checked in and posed for photos by the lakeside, I stood just off to the side. Calm, detached, ready. Melissa was in full form, greeting guests, joking with board members, glowing in the attention. She thought she had arrived. What she didn't realize was that everything she had spent the last 6 months trying to control was already out of her reach. I wasn't fighting for second light anymore. I had already taken the only things that mattered: the philosophy, the trust, the community. She was about to inherit a building and a brand. I was walking away with the soul. The retreat had all the trappings of a celebration: crisp name tags, catered breakfast, and a glossy welcome packet labeled Second Light the Future. Melissa stood center stage, perfectly rehearsed, as she clicked through her PowerPoint. She spoke of growth efficiency and national reach. She introduced a consultant from a private equity firm who, according to her, believed in our mission and wanted to invest in scaling it. The room nodded along, some with curiosity, others with unease. I watched from the back, hands folded, waiting. When she reached the final slide, a banner that read, "Evolution begins now," I stood up. Melissa smiled as if expecting me to say a few words in support. I didn't. Instead, I walked calmly to the front of the room and turned to face our team. I thanked Melissa for the introduction, then said I had something to share. I announced that as of that morning, I had officially resigned from Second Light. A quiet ripple moved through the room. I went on to explain that I was launching a new initiative, not a nonprofit, a consulting practice dedicated to helping community-based organizations implement trauma-informed support models for women in transition. I told them the model was already being piloted with 3 partner sites. Melissa's face froze, but I wasn't done. I thanked the funders who had quietly supported our new direction, some of whom were in the room. I mentioned that several key partnerships had already committed to the new framework and would no longer be sending referrals to Second Light in its current form. I turned back to Melissa and said respectfully that she now owned the name The Office and the official org chart, but I had taken the one thing she hadn't thought to protect: the trust, the culture, the values that made people believe in us in the first place. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The consultant beside her shifted uncomfortably. The staff looked from her to me and back again. For a few seconds, no one said a word. Then I smiled, stepped back from the front of the room and said, "I'll leave you all to your agenda. My next meeting starts in 20 minutes across town." And with that, I walked out, leaving behind the building, the brand, and the woman who thought she'd won. I hadn't asked anyone to come with me. I hadn't even hinted. But as I reached the door, Lynette, our senior program director, stood up and called my name. She held up her retreat packet, then quietly set it on the table and walked toward me. Then came David from Outreach, followed by Carla from Intake. One by one, the staff who had been with me through the toughest years stood, nodded, and joined me near the exit. By the time we reached the hallway, half the chairs in the conference room were empty. Melissa stood frozen at the front, gripping the edge of the podium. The consultant beside her whispered something, but she didn't seem to hear him. A woman from the Riverside Foundation, one of our biggest funders, stood and cleared her throat. She said that, until there was clarity around Second Light's direction and leadership, they would be pausing all grants and evaluations. No one clapped. No one cheered. It was quiet, steady, almost clinical. But the shift was undeniable. Melissa tried to regain control, calling after us, telling the room we'd violated policy, that this was all emotion and theater. I turned back only once. I looked her in the eye and said softly, "You bought the name." I took the heart. Her mouth opened slightly, but nothing came. No one followed her. No one offered a defense. And for the first time since that parking lot morning, I felt no anger, no regret. Just clarity. We stepped outside into the sunlight. I didn't rush. I didn't need to. The future was already unfolding, and this time it was mine. My new office was nothing like the one I'd left behind. It sat above a quiet community library with secondhand furniture and the faint smell of old books drifting through the vents. The window faced a patch of grass where kids played after school, and every now and then I could hear the faint hum of the library printer downstairs. On my first day, I unpacked a box with 3 notebooks, a coffee mug, and a small framed quote that used to hang near the front door at second light. I booted up an old laptop and checked the inbox tied to the new consulting site. There were 5 messages waiting. One was from a women's shelter in Minneapolis, another from a counselor in Florida. All of them said the same thing in different words. We heard what you're doing. We want to learn. Can we talk? By the end of that week, I'd hosted my first virtual workshop from a folding table with my notes taped to the wall and my dog curled at my feet. The work was small, the pace was slow, but it felt clean. It felt honest. One morning, a manila envelope arrived at the office with no return address. Inside was a folded letter on lined paper. The handwriting was familiar. It was from Tanya. She wrote that she'd heard about everything. She didn't know the details and she didn't need to. What mattered, she said, was that when she had nothing, I saw her as more than a case. She said she'd used the journal I gave her to write down every good thing that happened, no matter how small. And last week she read one of her own entries at a support group meeting. She wrote that it was the first time she spoke without crying. She ended the letter by saying, "You didn't save me. You taught me to save myself." And that's the only thing worth passing on. I sat with the letter for a long time. I didn't cry. I just breathed. For the first time in months, it felt like everything was exactly where it should be. Not perfect, but real. And that was enough. People think walking away means giving up. But I've learned that sometimes letting go is the only way to protect what matters most. You can pour your heart into something, give it everything you have, and still know when it's time to release it. Not because it failed, but because its shape changed. Holding on would mean losing yourself in the process. The hardest part wasn't losing the name or the building. It was realizing that keeping the soul of what I built meant starting again without it. I used to believe endurance was strength. Now I know that clarity is stronger, and peace, real peace, often waits on the other side of a quiet, deliberate no. If you've ever walked away from something you loved, not because it broke, but because it betrayed its own purpose, I'd love to hear what gave you the courage. What did you take with you? And what did you leave behind? Sometimes the bravest thing we do is not fighting harder. It's knowing when the fight is no longer worth it for us.